So we got a video of places you do not want to be. There are many places I don't want to be in life, but hey, in some cases I want to visit, in some cases I have to go. But either way, let's just jump into it, you know what I'm saying? That's what I want to say, yeah.
This is Texas Tower 4. It was one of several towers like it that stood miles off the coast in the middle of the Atlantic. The work on it was nerve-wracking.
No AI-generated content used, so all these pictures are legit. Thank you for telling me that. I truly appreciate that. I really do, because sometimes I wonder what happened in these sites or these places, and then they just show AI clips, and I'm like, this doesn't help. This doesn't. So what we're seeing right now was actually there. Thank you.
Weather was brutal, and if something went wrong, the men on board were truly stranded, alone in the ocean. This is the horrifying story of Texas Tower 4, and as always, viewer discretion is advised.
Scary things. Wait, scary, interesting. My brain right now, it's not responding.
In the 1950s, the United States was on edge almost like never before. With the Cold War,
Yeah, the Cold War, that's why they were on edge.
War in full effect, Soviet bombers could theoretically be on their way in any second. And if they made it across the Atlantic Ocean undetected, it would be devastating. So the US Air Force did what any anxious superpower would do under the circumstances. It started building towers in the middle of the ocean.
And submarines and boats and patrols and lighthouse patrols and stuff like that. But yeah, that we can go with that first, yeah.
Not just any towers though. These were known as Texas Towers, and they were massive radar platforms planted miles off the coast in the Atlantic, greatly resembling oil rigs you might see in the Texas oil field.
Oh, they're not oil rigs. I thought they were oil rigs. Because, okay, and they're not in Texas. They're in Boston, New York, Washington. So basically near those areas of the Atlantic Ocean. Because I'm like, Texas Towers? Okay, that's...
And they were designed to spot enemy bombers before they got too close in hopes of giving the US a precious 30 to 60 minutes of warning time to scramble jets and prepare defenses.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Basically, if something deadly was heading toward America, these towers were the eyes nervously scanning the horizon. Of these towers, Texas Tower 4 was the boldest of them all. It was planted 63 miles or 101 kilometers off the coast of Long Island, New York, in 185 feet or 56 meters of water. It was supposed to be, and in many ways was, a technological wonder, but from day one, Tower 4 was seemingly cursed. Not in some metaphorical way, as in the tower gave off bad vibes, but in the form of concrete flaws, support issues, and a sort of ever-present sense that the whole operation might be one gust away from disaster. Despite these issues, though, the role it played was crucial. Back then, that kind of early warning system was everything. With Tower 4 in place, the radar coverage was pushed hundreds of miles out to sea, giving the US an advantage it never had before in the Cold War. Tower 4's journey from blueprint to ocean platform began in December of 1956 in South Portland, Maine. The job went to J. Rich Steelers out of New York City, paired with Morrison Knudsen from Idaho. The two large construction firms were then tasked with creating a stable enough radar tower to ride out the fury of the North Atlantic. And on paper, the plan was solid: build the tower on land, float it out, anchor it down, and plug in the radar. And in fact, several months later, on June
That's how these things... Okay, that kind of makes... I thought they built them in the ocean. Okay, I think that makes me dumb.
28, 1957, Tower 4 was successfully floated and towed to its site, but the success of that step was relative. Somewhere in the process, as the steel legs rocked in the swells, 2 or 3 of these structural supports got knocked loose. Obviously not ideal when you're about to plant a top-heavy tower in deep churning water. So, faced with the choice of fixing it on-site or bringing it back to land, the Air Force chose the quicker of the two, which was to fix it where it stood. Now, to visualize these towers, for those who are just listening, imagine a giant tripod. Each tower stood on 3 long steel legs plunged into the ocean floor. These legs held up a sprawling platform nearly the size of a football field. Then on top of that sat massive radar domes like giant weatherproof beach balls, along with the living quarters, generators, and equipment. The towers had to have everything the crew would need to live and work sort of indefinitely until supply runs were made periodically. Once the tower was in position, as the crew tried to anchor the legs into position, rough weather rolled in. The storm then battered the braces, breaking one off entirely. These braces were large horizontal and diagonal supports that crisscrossed the
This is bad. This is just looking bad. No. I quit. No. First of all, the legs are not stable. Now the thing that's supposed to keep the legs separate or in a, I'm using my tripod, I can't. Basically, it's supposed to stay like this in a triangle. So if one gets closer, it's not stable. So the thing that's keeping them separate is not there anymore. It's not. So now we can just, we're cooked. It's chai. Well, it's over.
Legs to stabilize the structure and were crucial to keeping it standing. The Navy then tried to clean up the mess with a set of underwater repairs, and the plan was to replace the broken braces with new ones that would attach to the stubs of the original supports. Since those stubs were basically mangled leftovers, though, the new solution required clamping collars or big steel sleeves bolted underwater around the damaged joints. This was a janky fix at best, and it didn't really work. In fact, by the end of 1958, a report titled Texas Tower 4 Stability and Deficiencies made it crystal clear that the structure was in trouble. Divers found that half the bolts could be yanked out by hand, some weren't even the right size, and others had been shoved into holes that were too wide, probably in a hurry to get the job done.
I quit. There are so many red flags in this, and you still need to be here. This thing was literally being held together by hopes and dreams. You have bolts that don't belong there, and you have bolts that are not tightly fit. You can just, when I've learned about anything, cars, furniture, if you can just unscrew something like this with your bare hand, it's not in there. It's not. It's over.
But even still, the mission rolled forward. The radar domes went up in the form of 3 giant rubber enclosures housing sensitive electronics, and the tower was declared operational. It swayed and groaned and made the crew nervous, but in terms of expanding U.S. surveillance, it was doing its job. Now, the Texas towers might have been engineering marvels, but life aboard them, and particularly Tower 4, was miserable. To get airmen...
Man, these guys thought they were cool when they were taking this picture. They look at the guy on the left. He's ore farming. He's ore farming so hard.
To even volunteer for roles aboard the towers, the Air Force had to get creative. They placed an ad in the Air Force magazine that promised 30 days on an island with great fishing, excellent food, modern housing, and free movies every night of the week. They positioned the work...
Are you telling me? No, they were advertising this as a vacation for military, bro. They were like, oh, here's a military base, all they have to do is make sure you watch and enjoy. Nah, boy, that's the type of stuff that made me scared for my life.
As if it were a little offshore resort with a radar dish. Basically. And to sweeten the deal, the Air Force promised 2 weeks of leave for every 6 spent on the towers. This obviously sounded charming enough because applications flooded in, but the ads didn't mention the less palatable aspects of life aboard the towers, like the swaying or the bone-rattling vibrations from the radar domes, or the diesel generators that never stopped humming. The ads also neglected to detail a condition that became known as tower fever, which was the sense of dread that crept in after too many days of gray skies, relentless wind, and no way off. This was probably worsened by the fact,
no, I will go insane. People don't like me now. When I'm sane, people won't like me when I'm insane. No.
The tower structure wasn't just unstable, it was noisy. The steel legs that were plunged into the ocean amplified distant groans and booms, transmitting them upward like a massive tuning fork. The whole thing was alive with the sounds of creaking metal and the occasional unsettling rumble that reminded crew just how far from shore they really were. Even when things were calm, and they rarely were in the North Atlantic, getting to and from the tower was a logistical nightmare. Helicopter flights were dangerous enough that choppers were always sent out in pairs. One would land on the platform while the other hovered nearby, just in case the first one went into the ocean.
What?
And on bad weather days, which were common, the choppers didn't show up at all. And then there was the Donut. This was an improvised boarding system straight out of a cartoon. Picture yourself in a massive inner tube from an aircraft tire dangling from a crane high above the waters. You'd grab on, hold tight, and hope for the best as it was lowered or even dropped down onto a violently rolling ship. As you might imagine, even seasoned sailors and airmen wanted no part of it. Despite these risks and the isolation, though, there were also genuine attempts to boost morale and keep it high. Hobby shops were cobbled together on board, pizza parties and barbecues were held, beer rations were handed out, and yes, there really were movie nights.
No, this is making me scared, and I'm thousands of miles away from America right now. I'm not doing that. Hell freaking no, I'm not doing that. No. You don't understand why I'm feeling this way. Imagine just annoying sounds in general. Then you have to deal with that for days. Days. Okay? Okay. Driving from my province in South Africa to my other province, right, takes 6 hours, right? My mom's car makes a very annoying sound. And for 6 hours, that sound just been rattling over and 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 over. See, I could hold it because I know end of the day I'm gonna be in my bed sleeping when I get back. You know what I'm saying? But imagine that for 2 weeks. I will go insane. I will start. No.
But the charm wore off fast when the walls were vibrating and the foghorn, the world's largest by the way, was blasting in their ears every 29 seconds on foggy days. Suffice it to say, sleep was tough to come by for those stationed on the towers. And while they were built to handle the heavy seas with design specs that claimed they could take 125 mph winds and waves in excess of 35 feet or 10.5 meters, even a fraction of those caused problems. In fact, Towers 2 and 3 were positioned in significantly shallower waters than Tower 4, automatically making them more stable, but even they weren't immune to the sickening movement of the ocean. Tower 4, however, lurched and weaved, and it didn't feel like you were standing on something solid. It felt like you were constantly riding it. This is why the airmen and civilian contractors aboard Tower 4 nicknamed it Old Shaky. To make matters worse, by the early 1960s, the Texas towers were already a bit outdated. When they were first conceived, again, the threat was Soviet bombers flying low across the Atlantic, but by 1961, those bombers were replaced by intercontinental ballistic missiles. These new threats didn't fly slow and low, they rocketed at thousands of miles per hour. Tower 4 couldn't even spot a missile until it was already too late. The same 30 to 60 minute heads up it had once promised had been whittled down to something close to 30 seconds.
Damn.
Despite this though, the military decided to keep the tower staffed because of the threat of Soviet salvage. The US knew Russian ships were lingering nearby, and if any of the towers were left unmanned, there was the real fear that the Soviets would swoop in, grab the radar technology, and sail away with US secrets. So it was reasoned that it was better to keep a small crew aboard and hold the line, even if that line was rusting and swaying in the wind.
Hell no, just take.
By
Can't you just use boats? Can't you just be on boats? I swear.
early 1961, the crew aboard Tower 4 had been scaled down from 70 to just 28, which included 14 airmen and 14 civilian contractors, most of them repairmen. Their job wasn't so much defending the skies anymore as it was patching up a dying structure and keeping an eye out for unwelcome guests. Meanwhile, the tower itself was on borrowed time. The legs were still damaged from storms years earlier, and the retrofitted repairs hadn't held up, but the big blow came in September of 1960 with Hurricane Donna. The storm hit the tower with 100...
Hell no. Hell no. Hell no. That's the day I quit if I survive. That's the day I quit if I survive. If I survive. That's the day I quit. If I don't quit, I'm shark food. I'm shark food. Squid food that day. I'm not doing this. I am not doing this. I'm not scared of water, but this is the type of situation that'll make me go insane to be. Hell no.
32 mile-per-hour winds and waves at more than 50 feet or 15 meters high, far exceeding the design specs. When Hurricane Donna was done, Tower 4 was still standing, but just barely.
I quit. I'm gonna call everyone to take me home.
Inspections afterward revealed the underwater bracing had cracked and shifted, causing the tower to lose nearly half of its structural strength. At this point, it was basically one good hit away from collapse, but it stayed manned. And disturbingly, everyone was aware of these issues and knew it wasn't safe. They didn't need a fresh inspection report or a team of divers to tell them that though, just living on it made it obvious. It started creaking more than usual and swaying wider than it had before. In fact, the crew would often even joke with one another and warn that no one should ever shake with a straight razor on board. This light touch of humor might have been the only and best way to deal with the fear that permeated the crew. And beyond that, the vibrations from the radar equipment, generators, and even the ocean itself were also more intense. Captain Gordon Fellon, the man in charge on Tower 4, apparently repeatedly requested complete evacuations of the tower.
Yes.
He sent message after message to his senior officers, imploring them to give him the authority, but his requests were always denied.
F you.
The top brass was always still more concerned with Soviet salvage.
They are the least of your problems. I'll become your problem if I'm stuck in this boat for the next 2 days. Yo.
This would all culminate in mid-January when the tower got troubling news. Captain Sixto Mengual, commanding officer of the Navy supply ship that made trips out to Tower 4, warned Gordon directly that something nasty was brewing. Seas were getting rough and winds were shifting. If they were going to evacuate, they needed to start now, but Gordon still didn't have the authority to pull his crew. That power was still held with his superiors safely on land at Otis Air Force Base in Cape Cod. On the evening of January 14th, the weather advisory called for winds between 46 and 69 miles per hour. This wasn't welcome news aboard Tower 4, but it also wasn't anything the tower hadn't already survived. In fact, just 6 days earlier, it had gone through the same conditions without any major issues, but then the following day, on January 15th, the storm intensified. At 10 a.m., Gordon was asked if he was worried, and he responded that it didn't matter because it was already too late to evacuate. Conditions had
What? Oh, crap.
deteriorated fast, and helicopter flights were impossible. The waves were also too violent for the donut or any other transfer method. The window was shut, and for all intents and purposes, the crew of 28 aboard Tower 4 was stuck to ride it out. That afternoon, around 1 p.m., Gordon made a chilling call to his wife.
Oh, hell no. Oh, hell no, bruh. Dang. Nah, bro, I would have teared the thing apart to make a bone at that point. Hell no.
He told her that the tower was moving more than usual and warned her that if the tower fell into the ocean, none of them would survive. There would be no rescue, just the cold Atlantic, and that was before the forecast was updated at 3:30 p.m. to reflect wind gusts up to 86 miles per hour.
This feels like, ugh.
30 minutes later at 4 p.m., Gordon radioed Otis to report a loud cracking sound and a noticeable increase in the tower's sway.
It's over.
Finally, permission came down and Gordon was directly authorized to order an evacuation, but he and everyone aboard knew it was probably already too late. The weather had gotten even worse, and so instead of helicopters, the Navy and Coast Guard dispatched ships to the tower to initiate the evacuation, but they were still hours away and the storm was already on top of the tower. Gordon then called his wife again at 6 p.m., and this time he reported waves at 35 feet high and winds in excess of 98 miles per hour. The crew, meanwhile, was on deck throwing classified materials, including literal safes filled with secret documents, overboard to prevent them from falling into enemy hands should the tower be successfully evacuated. Then, at 6:45 p.m., Tower 4's final distress call crackled across the radio, reporting that the tower was breaking up. About 15 minutes later, Gordon radioed Sixto one last time and warned him to get the ship to the safety of port somewhere as quickly as he could. Sixto then reluctantly agreed, knowing that it was the right move, and wheeled the supply ship around. He then intently watched the radar blip representing Tower 4 on the screen in front of him until 7:28 p.m. when it completely vanished. The entire structure had collapsed into the Atlantic, taking all 28 men with it. Not a single man survived, and only 2 of the bodies were ever recovered. When Tower 4 finally slipped beneath the Atlantic, it left a wake of outrage, confusion, and grief that stretched from the icy waters off Long Island all the way to the halls of Congress. At Otis Air Force Base, where the tower had been monitored and managed, the response was fast, but far from comforting. A board of inquiry was convened immediately, and it didn't take long for heads to start rolling. As the investigation got underway, it was learned that his superior officers had given Gordon the authority to order an evacuation of Tower 4 in the event that he deemed one necessary in the days leading up to the collapse. It was just that no one bothered to inform Gordon of this. A colonel, who was the acting commander of the Boston Air Force Defense Sector, was then charged with involuntary manslaughter, and 2 other officers were also charged with dereliction of duty.
Yeah, because you kept denying just, yes, people.
This sounded like accountability and looked like justice, but it didn't last.
Of course.
By June of that same year, the charges against the commanding officer and executive officer were dropped, and in August, a court-martial board dismissed all charges against the colonel. Just like that, the legal fallout fizzled. No one was held responsible, and the message was loud and clear. Yes, mistakes were made, but apparently no one had actually made them. This obviously didn't sit well with anyone, and especially not the families of the 28 men who had lost their lives. Before the charges were dropped, however, the Senate stepped in and held hearings. This time, the conclusion pulled no punches. Human error, the committee said, was at the heart of it all. Engineers, building contractors, the Air Force, and the Navy, everyone had a hand on the wheel. The Navy in particular, though, came under fire for how it supervised the construction and repair of the tower. One jaw-dropping revelation also then came from the seabed itself. Tower 2, which was one of the more stable platforms positioned in much shallower water, had its legs driven 48 feet or about 15 meters into the ocean floor. The legs of Tower 4 were sunk just 18 feet or about 5 meters into the sandy bottom. That was all, less than half the depth and sitting in far deeper, more treacherous water. It was like building a high-rise on wet sand and then being surprised when it tilted. Meanwhile, back in the civilian world, the public was left with the haunting question of how this could have happened. How could a tower built with the express purpose of saving lives be the cause of so many deaths? Unfortunately, there were no satisfying answers, just a series of shrugged shoulders, legal loopholes, and quietly
Dang, bro. It broke off and fell. Oh, man. Oh, man, that was bad.
reassigned careers. In the end, Texas Tower 4 became a symbol not of Cold War might, but of what happens when bureaucracy and faulty engineering collide in a place where failure isn't an option. Today, what's left of Tower 4 still rests on the ocean floor, 185 feet below the surface. The site is deep enough to keep casual divers away, but shallow enough for experienced wreck divers to explore it, if they're brave enough to descend into the graveyard. The wreck has since become part of the sea floor, colonized by marine life, but if you know the story, it's impossible to look at those remains without feeling the weight of what happened there. And for decades, most people forgot about the Texas Towers. They were a Cold War experiment that never really worked, pushed aside by better technology, but Tower 4 left a scar. The men who died out there didn't go down in battle. They weren't lost in a firefight or taken by enemy hands. They were just doing their jobs, following orders, and trusting that someone somewhere had made sure that the ground, or in this case the platform, was solid beneath their feet. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum.
Nah, as I said, I quit. I am not doing this. I am not. But hey, my mom always says, hey, if you need a job, you gotta do it. And I'm like, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. You gotta pay me more than like 20,000 rand for me to do this job. For some people, that's very low. But hey, if you're not in a great position, then you got no choice. You know what I'm saying? Salute to those men. You were never meant to be out there. You gave multiple warnings. They never cared about y'all. Rest in peace. Yeah. Peace.